Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 Riparian Health Assessment Volunteer Training. Before we get started here, I'll just start with some quick Zoom basics. We're going to leave the videos off for the moment, just so we can stay undistracted as we continue the presentation. You also start muted, and there might be some time for questions at the end, but we'll ask that you remain muted until the end of the presentations. If you have any questions, you can always drop them into chat, and we can discuss them at the end as well. The agenda for tonight, we're basically going to go over a few reminders, including talking about the general volunteering video, an overview of what we're doing with the RHAs, a look at our sites that we'll be tackling this season, and we're going to talk about how we're going to do work this year, and as well as covering some safety information and the equipment you'll have. So I'm Dylan, first off. I'm the project coordinator for RHAs this season. So I'll be the person you'll be in contact with for any questions related to the content here this evening. If you have not had yet a chance to watch the general volunteering video for this year, it would be a good idea to do that as well when you're done with this presentation. The general volunteering video covers many of the safety related topics: signing up for MyImpactPage, using mobile time clock, the volunteer handbook, police safety checks, first and last 5 minutes, procedure, how we handle emergencies, and other general concerns related to how we handle the volunteer role. If you have some questions about how that stuff works after this training, you can always ask Kumiko or myself, of course. But if you need to know right away, this video might have the answers for you. All right, so volunteers are going to work in groups of 3. And the reason this is because this will help increase accuracy of your reporting. So because you're working in groups, you'll be able to double check each other's work. So how you schedule the volunteer work is really up to you. You're going to find partners who are free at the same time as you, and this works great to maximize the number of sections you're able to do as well. Because we're giving you 6 weeks to complete the RHAs. If you want more sections to do, and a lot of groups get very fast at doing their sections, we can always provide more work for you guys as well. So for this year's sites, these are the stretches we're going to do. They're listed down here on the side, on the left-hand side, and they're represented in the photograph here. We'll be going over these in better detail once we're actually at the training. The reason they're laid out like this is because it's related to pathway access. You can see mostly we're sticking to areas we'll have access with the truck, just in case those areas do need to be restored. We'll be able to get to them with equipment and stuff. So last year when we did the RHAs, we moved the entire process onto ArcGIS, and it seemed to go over well with everyone. So we're going to do it again this year. This will save the data you're taking directly into the app and won't require you to send a scan of the paper copy. This will probably take some more cell phone battery to do so. So expect a bit of a higher battery drain on your device as a result. We'll go over the specifics when we do the field training on Saturday. And that's what the form looks like. When we do talk about the information on Saturday, you'll be able to enter all of that into the form here. Now, cows and fish also have an application that they're using to track riparian health assessments. We at the Friends don't receive any of the data from this app, but what I found it useful for is all of the resources in PDF form that can be found here. It also walks you through the assessment questions by question and explains the scoring. While the information for scoring the site is provided in paper form in the equipment kits, the PDF is useful for those who prefer using their phone, or if you'd like to reduce paper waste by not using the paper copy. So prepping for a shift. Try not to bring anything valuable with you during your shift. Anything fragile like glass containers or precious items should be left at home. Earbuds are also an item to leave behind. While bringing your dog does sound fantastic, because the assessments are all done off the pathway, having a dog in those areas could disturb wildlife using the space. Things you should make sure to bring, though, are definitely a good pair of boots and clothes for the weather. So if you have rain gear and rain is in the forecast, which it looks like for this Saturday, You might want to bring along something like that, an umbrella, of course, rain pants, very good. We are going to be walking around in the grass, so expect your legs to get wet if there is rain that day. Sunscreen and bug spray, more important for those sunny days, but having those items too is a very good way while out on your shift to protect yourself, and making sure you have like enough food as well as a way to record the information. If you are using the paper forms, making sure to have a pen and stuff. Basically just being prepared. Now, the first and last 5 minutes are an important part of our safety system that keeps us from injury, mostly by looking at and reviewing all of the safety items before our shift begins, as well as recording any incidents that happen. So the first 5 minutes form helps us keep track of all the safety items in a nice checklist. So you'll be able to scroll through and check to see whether or not items such as really hot weather affect you, or if you're going off trail, if it's very treacherous, making sure to keep note of those things. And it basically makes it so you can remind you and your group on how to proceed safely out in the park. Now, the last 5 minutes is an equally very important form. He helps us track all sorts of statistics while we're in the park. So keeping track of how many sites we assessed on a single day and how many people we talked to, those sorts of things. Both forms are available on the website, and more information on both of them is available in the general volunteering video. So the mobile time clock too allows hours tracking for all the field work we do. It's just in the MyImpactPage app. It's important to use it because it allows us to know who's in the field at any moment. So in the event of an emergency, we can get in contact with you. Just make sure to start the clock before doing your first 5 minutes and ending the clock after doing the last 5 minutes. Now, checking better impact, a lot of you are new volunteers, so we will get you to sign volunteer agreements as well. If you've done this already, don't worry about it. It gets you covered by our WCB in exchange for reading the parts of the volunteer handbook that apply to your volunteering role. It also acts as a photo release, though I understand if you may not want to be included in photos, and that's fine. Just let us know your preference so we can respect your boundaries there. All right, so here are the safe work protocols in the volunteer handbook that we have that are specific to Riparian Health Assessment volunteers. The more general ones are listed up top as well. It's important to review the volunteer handbook just to make sure you're up to date on all of our policies. Now, first aid kits are required while doing an outing, and they're there to be used in case you need them. Band-aids on the outside of the kit are in case of small scrapes and don't need to be reported unless you need a lot of them. If an injury is serious enough for you to consider using more than one Band-aid, also consider opening up the kit. If you use your kit, you need to fill out the report form inside the kit and get it to staff within 48 hours. Letting staff know as soon as an emergency happens is also important. There's more details on the first aid kits in the general volunteering video. The field question resolution map is designed to answer questions that either you or other parks visitors might have. It informs you on what to do if something happens and if you're unsure of how to handle it. The 310 land is a good catch-all number if you can't remember any other. You can also download a copy of this from our website or ask to have the PDF sent to you. You can also receive a hard copy on request as well. So police checks. They're an important thing to get done anytime we have volunteers working independently from staff. It's policy that we have them done by volunteers working with us who have access to equipment or working in groups alone with other people. It's also for building access. I understand that they can take a while to complete, and sometimes circumstances make them harder to obtain. So I don't like making it a bear to people who are just starting to volunteer with us. The convenient thing is once you get them done, you don't need to worry about having them done over and over again. Now, before I hand things off to Catherine here, some friendly reminders. It's important that we read the volunteer handbook and the volunteer agreement. Reviewing the SWPs before we begin work is going to be important. The first and last 5 minutes need to be done for each and every shift. I should also mention that only one set of each forms has to be done per group. Everyone has to log hours, but you only need to do one first 5 minutes and last 5 minutes form per group. Keep in mind too, if you're looking for other volunteer opportunities in the park, you can always check MyImpactPage and they'll be available there for you to browse. You should also only participate within instructions and scope of the activity. If you find the activity you're doing seems unsafe to you for any reason, you should always stop doing that at that time. Only participate within your comfort. You must also make sure to report injuries within the 48-hour window. Now, staying in touch with us, feel free to do it during the season. We're always happy to hear from the volunteers. You can also stay informed through our newsletter, and I'm trying to keep our Instagram account updated more often as well, so you can also check that out. All right, there's some of my contact information. So if you have more questions, you can always send me an email or call or text the number below, and that'll allow you to get in contact with me. Catherine, if you'd like to take it away.
Yeah, so I thought to start the evening, I'll give you a little bit more of an introduction and a background to myself and the organization that I work for. So my name is Catherine Hull, and I'm a riparian specialist with the Alberta Riparian Habitat Management Society. For some reason, people don't remember that one, and we're known better as Cows and Fish, and I'll talk more about our organization. And the intent this evening is really to give people, first of all, stepping back a bit and talking about riparian areas in general and thinking about how riparian areas function. That'll be sort of the first part of the presentation. And then I'll go a little bit more specifically into some of the assessment piece. So talking through some of the indicators that we look at when we do riparian health assessments, and walking you through a little bit of the process of how we do a riparian health assessment. And then of course, on Saturday, there'll be plenty of opportunity to talk more about that and to actually have an opportunity to put it into practice. But before I go further, I do want to, of course, recognize and acknowledge that today I'm speaking to you from Calgary. And in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we honor and acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Métis Nation of Region 3, and all the peoples who make their home in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So just a little bit of background as well about myself. So I actually grew up in South Africa. I spent a large portion of my childhood there until I was about 14. And certainly that experience of growing up in Africa and really getting to see the sort of the large megafauna that make their homes in these African wildernesses really inspired in me in an early age, a real love, awe, appreciation, and fascination with the natural world. And that certainly sort of propelled me to want to become a biologist, and certainly motivated me in the work that I do. And so in coming to Canada, I studied first at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, where I got my sort of Bachelor of Science degree in biology, land use, environmental studies. I then went on to do a master's degree actually at the University of Calgary. And my master's degree thesis, the picture on the left there is the Cypress Hills. If anyone's been down to the Cypress Hills, certainly a place that's close to my heart. And I did, for my master's study, I did a grassland bird study in relation to grazing management and range health. And then I went on to do some consulting, a lot of which was for some of the nature conservancies and other land trusts. And that allowed me to explore areas that are just absolutely spectacular. For example, areas in and around Waterton, which is certainly one of my absolute favorite places in the world. I would say just a real spectacular place. And now I enjoy spending time and enjoying the wilderness and these places right in our backyard here in Calgary with my son, who's now 7 years old. So that's certainly a lot of my time nowadays is spent with him. And so it seems like a natural fit for me, the work that I do with cows and fish. We are a nonprofit organization that's been around for about 30 years now. And our mission is really to promote healthy landscapes by fostering riparian stewardship. And really what we're trying to do is we try to empower people, as it says here, who both live, work, and play in these riparian areas to take action to care about them and to try to maintain the health of these areas going into the future. And just to give you a bit of background about our organization, so as I said, yeah, actually last year was our 30th anniversary. And featured here, these two gentlemen here are certainly two people who've inspired me and been great motivators to me in my career. On the left in the checkered shirt is Lauren Fish. He was previously a fisheries biologist with the government. And on the right is Barry Adams, formerly a provincial range management specialist. And both of them were sort of the founders, I'd say, of Cows and Fish, and really set in motion what it is that we do. And we really do have our roots sort of deeply planted in southwestern Alberta near Fish Creek, where 3 decades ago, Barry and Lauren began working more closely with the ranching community to both exchange ideas and share knowledge to find common ground in tackling growing concerns at that time around degrading fish and fish habitat and also water quality issues. And the photograph there on the left is some of the early days of Cows and Fish with roundtable discussions with some of the local ranchers. That's actually Hilton and Alta Ferris and their kitchen table, where the whole idea of Cows and Fish sort of came to be. And they were among some of the first ranchers to adopt riparian grazing management practices to help recover habitat for dwindling cutthroat trout populations on their Elkhorn Farm ranch in southwestern Alberta. And sitting around that table were, of course, Barry and Lauren, but also representatives of the Alberta Beef Producers and Trout Unlimited Canada. Alberta Beef Producers and Trout Unlimited Canada, hence the cows and the fish, were two of our key founding partners. And as you can see from this slide, we now have sort of a number of other different members and supporters, including prominently the Alberta government, the rural municipalities of Alberta, the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, and the Association of Agricultural Fieldmen. So today we work in close partnership, not just with ranchers, of course, but with many other landowners, agricultural producers, urban and rural municipalities, and community groups across the province. And we recognize and acknowledge that it's not just unmanaged grazing that can have an influence on fish and fish habitat, and also water quality, since ultimately fish are, after all, a product of the watershed. And as our watersheds have become increasingly busy, so too have we seen dramatic declines or extirpations of many of our native fish species across Alberta. So just as fashion trends in Alberta have changed quite dramatically over time, fishing just ain't what it used to be. This is a photograph from the Glenbow archives of a group of pretty remarkably well-dressed fishermen, I would say, just back from a successful fishing expedition along Trout Creek in the foothills of southwestern Alberta in 1902. And here's another entry and record that Lauren dug up from 1903 archives of the Calgary Herald, where 2 sportsmen, as it says here, went out after trout at Fish Creek, and as a result brought back 400 fish. So this is certainly, not only do we not see catches like that anymore, but there certainly are a number of changes that have happened on our landscapes over that time period. And so with cumulative land use changes that happen incrementally over many decades, sometimes it's easy to lose perspective of what our watersheds once looked like. These are actually photographs, aerial photographs that were taken of Willow Creek Valley, where, now in many reaches, you'll have trouble finding a single living willow and not much in the way of cutthroat trout either. And sometimes we have to find these types of fence line contrasts to remind us what the potential of the land is. So a process of working with communities begins with this awareness and this understanding and trying to connect the dots for folks to show how our activities and the choices that we make on the landscape do have an impact on our watersheds and our watershed health, and in the biodiversity, the fish, the wildlife that inhabit this watershed with us. And then by helping to build a foundation of knowledge of our parent ecosystems, We hope to build sort of a common perspective of the landscape. So we kind of want to get away from this idea of pointing fingers and finding blame, and rather look toward how do we work together to find solutions? How do we build teams of people, connect folks that can work together to start address some of these issues and equip them with the right tools so that they can begin to take action. And of course, the monitoring piece, the riparian health evaluations are really important to help us understand where we've come from and where we're at and where we're going. So, the tool, the Riparian Health Assessment that you're going to be putting into action over the summer is one of several sort of the tools that we've developed, and they were developed in collaboration with colleagues out of Montana, formerly with the University of Montana's Riparian and Wetland Research Program. And we have a dedicated field crew. Our organization has a dedicated field crew that actually goes out and does sort of close to 200 sites a year. We actually do a more lengthy inventory, so much more detailed inventory, rather than just the basic health assessment. And to date, we've assessed over sort of 3,000 sites, as you can see by the little dots on this map. And as you can see, many of those are sort of streams. We've only done about 600 lentic or wetland sites as well. And this is the pie chart here. It kind of shows you where we're at in terms of provincially riparian health. So about a quarter of the sites that we've looked at are in that red or unhealthy category. And the majority, about 47%, are in what we consider the healthy with problems category. And just under a third are in what we call the healthy category. So that kind of gives you a sense of where things are at provincially. But this is not necessarily random sampling of sites. This is sites that we work with different communities, groups, and watershed groups across the province. But what does give me hope, and I think what is hopeful to see, is that where we've had the ability to go back and revisit sites, so look at the same site more than once and start to examine trends, and we've done this for about almost 600 sites across the province, what you can see is that there is an increasing trend in terms of healthy sites and a downward trend in sites that are in the unhealthy category. And so that's pretty encouraging to see. And we did do recently a survey that we had conducted independently to try to understand what is motivating people to make changes on the landscape and positive changes. And what came out of that is that it's not because people are being given money to do this, it's because it comes out of a greater sense of responsibility to manage these areas and a greater awareness about the importance of these areas for water quality, for biodiversity, and riparian health in general. And we know that we're successful when landowners like Francis Gardner take on the attitude that, if the land isn't healthy, neither my family or the ranch will be. So it comes down to understanding the sustainability of the landscape is tied to how we manage these areas. And if we can maintain them in a healthy way, that's going to be beneficial to the sustainability of ranching operations and other land uses as well. And so we often hear the term sort of stewardship thrown around a lot. But to us, what it means is what Aldo Leopold, so the grandfather of conservation, would say, that we abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. But when we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. So it's this attitude shift that really is what we're trying to work toward in terms of promoting stewardship across the province and where we do work. And certainly in Fish Creek Provincial Park, and all of those of you who are dedicating your time to volunteer, there's been tremendous strides in terms of watershed stewardship right here in Fish Creek Provincial Park. And I'm going to let Shayna say that much more eloquently than I can. This is a little video, if I can get it to work, that was put together by Shayna Barber, who used to be the coordinator with the Friends of Fish Creek. And I'm just going to play a little video. Dylan can tell me, is the sound working okay, Dylan? Maybe just put a little thumbs up if you can hear the sound.
I, like so many others, am blessed to call Fish Creek Provincial Park my backyard. One of the largest, most expansive urban parks in North America, it is nestled like a safe haven amidst the bustling activity of the city. A protected area which exists because of the foresight of those who recognized why it was important to protect it in the first place. Every day I see people receiving the gifts bestowed upon them by this park, all within a city of over 1 million people. It is loved and cherished by many. But is it possible to love a place too much? With over 3 million visitors each year, we have the capacity to do good or to do great harm, at best if we are careless or unaware of the impact we have, and at worst, if it is purposeful. I have seen this happen, and yet I have also seen what happens when people make the conscious choice of park stewardship. Volunteers of all ages come to support the Friends of Fish Creek, to lend a hand, to give of themselves, to care for, nurture, and help heal the land. They are the hands and the heart of this park in every sense, and they allow me to do what I do. As we work together to restore a small section of stream banks severely impacted by human use, I watched as they experienced the joy of community and the communion with nature. I watched them try things they have never tried before, digging post holes and trenches, moving tons of mulch and earth, lifting massive weights of deadwood, hauling water, planting hundreds of willow cuttings and poplar seedlings, and eventually blocking off the banks to allow healing with time and space. I watched them share their personal gifts with each other, teaching, learning, and supporting one another while giving back to their community. I am humbled by their selflessness and at the love they have for this place. In that, the earth receives, as do we all. It lifts my spirit, and it brings me hope.
All right. Oops, I should have credits played at the end there. So I think what I'll do at this point, I'll open it up to a few questions, and then we'll maybe take a little bit like a 5-minute break if people just need a quick bio break, and we'll come back in about 5 minutes, and then I'll start into the next presentation segment, which will be talking about sort of the riparian areas and how they function, some of the ecological functions of riparian areas, which sort of sets the foundation for the Riparian Health Assessment piece. So yeah, so in the second sort of segment of the presentation this evening, I'm going to talk a bit about riparian form and function. So I've spoken a lot about riparian areas and realized that I haven't exactly explained what they are, but this is what I hope to do in this presentation. So what is a riparian area and what makes it so special? Well, our job in Southern Alberta is usually pretty easy. We like to say that anything that's still green on the landscape by, late August or early September, if it's still bright green, it's probably a riparian area. So these are areas next to water, close to water, that are influenced by that water body. And so it becomes a little bit more challenging as you go further north to explain what a riparian area is, because of course the landscape is much different, where you have much in the boreal forest, for example, where you have a lot of green. And so essentially what a riparian area is a transition zone between that wet aquatic environment and the drier uplands. So it's that wetter floodplain, the valley bottom, and that fringe or shoreline around our water bodies. Sorry. So for lakes and wetlands, the riparian edge, or the riparian edge of those water bodies, for a large permanent lake with an open water, the riparian area encompasses that fringe of emergent vegetation, so the cattails and bulrushes that grow out in the water, that's part of the riparian zone. And then it extends right back to the sort of front edge of the willows or poplars that might be growing along that water body as well. For smaller bodies like that grassy picture there on the top right, the riparian area is essentially the entire water body for some of these seasonal and temporary wetlands. So it's essentially areas that are influenced by that high water table, where you have water modified soils and then plants that respond to that. So it's that real sort of ecotone area of areas where you have high water table affecting the soils, and then allowing for more productive and unique types of vegetation to thrive. So some of the characteristics or common indicator species of riparian areas are these plants. This is what we call a sedge. We'll show you some examples of these on Saturday. They're grass-like plants that grow right along the banks of our streams and rivers and along wetlands. And they have typically a triangular stem. So we like to say sedges have edges. And then, of course, we have our true bulrushes. These are the plants that like to grow really right out in the water along the edges or margins of those permanent water bodies. And then cattails as well, which would grow in that emergent zone as well. Cattails have that sort of characteristic hot dog shaped seed head and are important for a number of reasons, not the least of which is sort of wildlife habitat, but they also have tremendous filtration abilities that I'll talk about. And then, of course, willows. There's all different kinds of willows. We don't expect you to know the different species of willows. There are many. We just need to be able to have you identify what is a willow and understand that it's an important indicator of riparian health, as are red osier dogwoods. This picture on the bottom here, characteristic red bark, white berry that develops later in the season. Really an indicator of a healthy site if you do have a lot of red osier dogwoods. And then, of course, certainly along Fish Creek and along the Bow, most of our major river systems, we find poplar trees. In this case, it's balsam poplar. There are three sort of species of poplar in Alberta: the cottonwood species and the narrowleaf poplar, which occur further south in the Oldman basins, and then the balsam poplar, which is basically found throughout and certainly is common in Calgary. So where we have healthy, functioning riparian areas, these areas provide us with a tremendous suite of ecological goods and services that are represented here. Everything from clean water, stable water supplies, tourism values, fish and wildlife habitat, and of course, habitat for different plants as well. So that plant species diversity, which provides productivity for livestock and forage for wildlife. And certainly riparian areas are magnets, I'd say, for tourism and recreation. I couldn't live in Calgary if there weren't such beautiful river valleys and places like Fish Creek to escape to right in the city. These are areas that certainly my family loves to, we'll spend all of our time in these areas in the city. And these areas, do provide vital opportunities for enriching our quality of life, providing us with us some mental sanity, I would say, in an urban environment. And of course, these areas are home to all sorts of fish and wildlife species. So certainly all of our fish in Alberta rely on riparian areas, as do many invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, and all sorts of different birds, and of course, many large mammals as well. So when we think about riparian areas and some of the functions that they provide in terms of water, water quality, and also helping to maintain stable water supplies, why these areas are so important is that they're essentially Mother Nature's filters, the kidneys of the landscape. So where we have dense, lush, riparian vegetation around our water bodies, these areas sort of filter, absorb runoff and incorporate the nutrients that comes off of runoff of the landscapes into their biomass. And so they act as this giant filter and buffer around our water bodies. So cattails, as I mentioned, do a fantastic job of sucking up nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and incorporating that into their biomass. They also filter out some of the sediment particles and trap those within the roots and prevent some of that sediment and any of the contaminants that may be attached to those sediment particles from getting into the water. So where we do have flood events, riparian plants slow the flow of any runoff that comes off the landscape or any overland flow. And as you can see, Noreen's standing there in a big pile of mud, but essentially that sediment that's trapped by the plants will end up forming new banks. And sort of floods help to revive and revitalize our riparian areas and provide nutrients in the floodplain that stimulate growth. And all of that material that's being held back by the plants, again, helps to keep the water clean. And another way that riparian areas and plants that grow in these areas are important is that they have deep-rooted plants. Where we have healthy riparian areas, we've got a mix of trees, shrubs, sedges, all the understory plants, and those roots that those plants have hold onto the soil and really slow down and resist erosion. And so that helps as well to keep our water clean. And it's especially important for trout streams. Many trout streams will have this deep, narrow channel profile that's maintained by those densely rooted plants growing along the banks. So in Calgary, where we saw the most erosion and loss of bank habitat in the river, were areas where previously we had pretty unhealthy habitats, where we had just grasses and weeds growing along the bank. That's where we had oftentimes tremendous amount of bank loss. Plants like Kentucky bluegrass, which is your common lawn grass, have very, very shallow roots, very sort of a mat forming grass, and does very little to resist erosion. And we know that one of the ways that riparian areas function is, of course, the very basic principle that everything flows downhill, everything operates with gravity, and water is actually a pretty heavy substance, and so it's pulled downhill under the influence of gravity. And that sort of, you can think of the stream as sort of being like a little engine that has horsepower, and how much horsepower stream's engine has depends on the slope of the stream, the amount of flow, and the resistance along the channel. So in many of our streams, we'll see this meandering channel, so kind of the snake-like pattern that these streams form. And that's kind of a pattern that forms based on this water flowing under the influence of gravity. And you're going to see always in any system, even in the healthiest systems, you're going to see some amount of erosion happening on the outside bend, where you have sort of the greatest force of that erosion. And then as the water slows down around the inside bend, that's where you have these point bars and deposition areas forming. And so there's always sort of this balance of some erosion and then deposition happening within these meandering stream systems. And this makes our riparian areas quite dynamic. So the fault that many of our planners have made, and maybe can still continue to make, is that we think of streams and rivers as being the static line on the map, this blue line that's not going to change. Whereas in reality, our streams and rivers are quite dynamic. In particular, rivers like the Elbow River, is really quite mobile and migrates across a really wide floodplain and changes and shifts its channel over time. So you'll see in these images here, this is an image of 2007 image in the Weaselhead Park of the Elbow River, and then the photo to the right is an image that you can see where there's a new channel that was cut through, where the river sort of carved a new channel. And that's a common process when you sort of get this pinching off of those lobes, and then you're left with what's called an oxbow lake that then forms a wonderful wetland habitat within the floodplain. So where we can leave room for the river, that certainly allows for these dynamic processes to happen. And so where we have these healthy, well-vegetated riparian areas, they chug along there. They kind of move slowly. These meanders help to slow the flow of the water. And then that water then in a flood event would dissipate across that floodplain and distribute that moisture and energy. Now, where we start to lose some of the functional pieces of riparian habitat, so where we start to change and alter and tinker with the pieces of the riparian habitat, where we lose a lot of the natural vegetation, that's where things start to unravel and can start to fall apart, and where we start to see degradation of health. This is a pretty extreme example of a slumping riverbank, lots of accelerated erosion. In this case, it's unmanaged cattle grazing. That's sort of one of the causes of that. And all you're left with along the bank here is just shallow-rooted grasses. And what that can do over time is widen the channel profile. So from being rather that deep, narrow channel, you end up with a shallow, wide channel that, of course, from a temperature perspective, becomes a lot hotter as well. And you don't have that, the deepness is often associated with cooler temperatures. And of course, that vegetation that should be there also cools and shades the stream. Whereas in this case, you have nothing to shade the stream. And that, of course, is detrimental to fish. And so again, where you lose that riparian edge vegetation, and where you have sort of, whether it's agriculture or off-highway vehicles, you can start to see impacts where we lose that riparian vegetation. And you see the sediment here, just this mud sort of just bleeding into the river. This picture on the right is actually one taken in the McLean Creek zone. This stream, I'll show you a picture later on of we have done some restoration work. Then this fence was just put in right after this photograph was taken, and now it's quite nicely revegetated through there. But at that time, you can see the stream was sort of running dark brown as that mud just flowed unfiltered into the stream. And so it's the cumulative impact of all of our land uses in the landscape that really influence our water quality report card. And that, of course, has consequences to us in terms of water quality and in terms of impacts to fish populations as well. And more commonly, we're seeing these, advisories in terms of algae blooms and so forth, where we can't even swim in the water because it's not safe. And again, it's not usually one contributing factor, it's accumulation of what we're doing in the landscape that leads to these types of water quality degradations. And where we also have other impacts to water quality is where we have a lot of alterations that happen within either the shoreline of our lake or our wetland or within the whole floodplain of our stream and river. And so you can think of riparian areas when they're healthy, essentially they're like a giant sponge. So they soak up water, they absorb water, but where you compress that sponge, whether it's by off-highway vehicles, motorized activity, construction, mowing the lawn repeatedly, cattle grazing, all these activities on the landscape compress that riparian sponge. And what that means is that when the rain falls, it's going to run off really quickly into the water bodies, as opposed to soaking in and being absorbed by that riparian sponge. And so again, that has impacts in terms of water quality as well, and also in terms of water storage, because you lose that ability to store the water within these riparian landscapes. And so these are examples of sort of alterations that we commonly see in riparian areas. And of course, that type of issue is exacerbated within our urban environments where we have a lot of impervious surface. So a lot of roads, paved surfaces, this really changes the whole dynamic of how water flows off the landscape and how water is stored on the landscape. And so typically this is just a little diagram showing what happens to water in these different types of landscapes. So with an urban environment, what we see is that the water flows really quickly off the landscape after a storm event, whereas in a forested landscape, the water is going to be absorbed and then will flow much more slowly off the landscape, so a lot more absorption. So a lot less discharge happening immediately after a storm event. So this would be what our landscapes in Calgary, what many of them might have looked like before development happened. And the amount of sort of water coming off that landscape after a storm event would be pretty minimal. Once we start to change these landscapes, develop these landscapes, remove that vegetation, compact the surface, put in impervious surface, what happens is we exponentially increase the amount of runoff that's coming off those landscapes. And that, of course, has pretty detrimental consequences as well to the health of our aquatic environments and our riparian environments. This is actually Nose Creek in Calgary, which unfortunately has seen a lot of adverse or detrimental changes because of stormwater runoff far beyond sort of the natural range of variability for that stream. And in Calgary, there's been a lot of advances in terms of stormwater management, but in some of the older neighborhoods where there are no pre-treatment storm ponds, any of that stormwater then would have historically or traditionally would have just been, emptied from a storm pipe directly into the river. And you can see the impact that that could have where the Nose Creek enters the Bow River. Now we do have a lot of these stormwater wetlands within some of our communities to kind of pre-filter and treat stormwater. This is kind of showing you some of the issues that we have with some of those storm ponds, a lot of algae blooms, a lot of maintenance that's still required here. So certainly there's lots of solutions that need to happen within the upland environment to address this. So innovative techniques like rain gardens, rooftop green roofs, and then low impact development techniques. So we need all of these activities to happen within a landscape to start to address some of these issues. Sometimes just changing where your downspout is flowing rather than having it flow right off onto your driveway and putting it onto the patch of vegetation, that in itself will allow some of that stormwater to be absorbed rather than rushing directly into the storm grate. Oops, sorry. So this is kind of just some images that show the change in Calgary's footprint over time. So that yellow line shows what Calgary looked like in 1951, and you fast forward to 2007, and that's now the red outline. And this is modeling work that was done by LCs, and if you were to project the footprint of Calgary into the future under the sort of the current and the types of land practices and land development practice that we've seen to date, this is what Calgary's footprint is projected to look like by 2052. So certainly engulfing and and expanding quite dramatically. But we're hoping that this, Calgary will start to look at more densification schemes and ways that we can reduce some of this footprint as it goes forward. This is kind of playing as a business as usual type of scenario, but hopefully we won't see this to this extreme. So again, these are photographs of Nose Creek, one of the more heavily impacted streams within the city, which has also suffered from being a product of development, is that the old meanders that used to flow, and this used to be a really productive trout stream, most of Nose Creek sort of below Airport Trail is fully channelized. It's been straightened, and that has also had a consequence to the health of this system. So anywhere you channelize and straighten rivers by removing the meander bends, this of course speeds up the flow of the water. And if you double the water velocity, essentially as it says here, you quadruple its ability to erode, and that gives it the ability to transport 64 times the amount of material. So you can have a lot of erosive impact where you take out those natural meander bends. So certainly that is an issue as well. On the flip side, where we have done a good job in Calgary is in West Nose Creek. So West Nose Creek, this is in Confluence Park, where we do see still some of those meander bends and some of the floodplain habitat that has actually been conserved. So we do have some parks, and of course, Fish Creek Provincial Park would be an example of one that we have conserved entirely. And so we have retained many of those natural functions within some of these systems where we do have we've given these streams and rivers more room. Now, of course, we all know and have heard the dire warnings of climate change and the hot future that we're facing. This is, of course, clear evidence for it in this graphic here. I don't know what else needs to be said. But certainly we know that one of the predictions, and we're seeing this already, is of course more extreme events are more likely to happen, and that includes floods. But one thing I think we often forget about, we often hear these negative stories about floods and flooding, and forgetting that floods have always happened within our streams and rivers. And in fact, floods are a natural part of all riparian ecosystems, and many of these ecosystems rely on periodic floods to maintain their health and function. And I think that's something we often forget about. And that's simply because we've chosen to develop in these floodplains. And so in doing that, we sort of cashed in our natural insurance policy, because where we do have undeveloped floodplains, these are areas where that water can dissipate the energy, it can spread out, it can diffuse, it can absorb into the landscape. And that in turn actually, reduces some of the damage from these floodeds downstream. But it also helps revitalize whole ecosystems and communities. And in particular, poplar forests are reliant on floods and periodic flooding. And if any of you have noticed, so poplar trees have this, are called cottonwoods for a reason. And you'll see at this time of year, the cottonwoods just kind of erupt. And for those of you with allergies, I'm sorry, I feel sorry for you, but this must be a tough time, because you'll see this cotton fluff, which is essentially the seeds being released. And the cottonwood and the poplar trees, what they do is they time the release of these seeds to coincide with peaks in the river flows and peaks in when we have these sort of normal spring flows and spring flood events. And that's because these little cottonwoods, where they do best is they establish in some of these newly deposited gravel bars, flood scoured surfaces, and so forth. And that's where you start to see a flush of new poplars. So before the 2013 flood, there was actually a lot of concern about Calgary's poplar forests, in that they were dead and dying, or just getting to the point of being quite sort of decadent. And this flood of the 2013 flood event, after that, we've now seen a whole new islands and whole new sort of communities of young poplars coming up along the Bow River, where new islands were formed, where you have this renewal process happening. So that's one of the untold, maybe good news stories of the 2013 flood, is that it did have this benefit in rejuvenating our poplar forests. And certainly there's been a lot of research that's been done out of the University of Lethbridge, led by Dr. Stuart Rood, who's shown that, our damming and water diversions, but certainly damming of our watercourses has really been detrimental to the health of poplars in the prairie region of the province. So, for example, he's done work along the St. Mary and the Waterton River in southern Alberta. The St. Mary's was dammed in 1951. The Waterton River was dammed in 1964. And what they found, when they compared it to an undammed river, the Belly River, is they found that there was a 48% reduction in sort of this poplar regeneration along the St. Mary, and a 23% reduction along the Waterton River related to damming, because you're stabilizing the flow, you're not allowing for sort of the natural sort of flow or flood patterns to happen that promote this regeneration process. So it's, again, another thing to think about when we're developing our landscapes, is that the more dams, diversion, and other sort of mitigations that we put into place do have these unforeseen impacts in terms of the ecological health of our ecosystems. And certainly in a prairie environment, and as we face a hot, dry future, it's important to remember that these poplar forests, especially in our drier landscapes, these are often the only wooded areas within the prairie area. So these are our watery woodlands. These are vital for biodiversity and just, create this unique habitat. So poplars, especially for our larger rivers and streams, are really a keystone species. They're essentially, really critical for water quality, riverbank stability, woody habitat, for providing sort of shading habitats, for sort of fostering a whole community of plants. And also they're vital for flood, drought, and climate resilience. So certainly within an urban environment, they help to cool our environment, they're absorb and store flood water, and they buffer the impacts of flood and drought. So these are photographs of the 2013 flood. As I mentioned, this is one of the most costly sort of natural disasters that we've seen. But what I think a lot of people may not realize is that floods have happened several times before in Calgary's history. It's just that we've sort of have a very short-term memory, it seems, and we forget about this. So this is a headline in 1929, where you can see the Calgary Stampede, completely submerged, and that was in 1929. So it's just unfortunate that as we've built out and continue to build and develop our cities, we haven't learned from some of these historic flood events to kind of remove ourselves out of these flood areas. And as Lauren likes to say, the best way to protect people from floods is to protect floodplains from people. And I think that's something to keep in mind. Now we face this, future where we're going to continually have to, arm ourselves and be prepared for these flood events, and continue to invest in costly mitigation measures to be able to live in these areas as we have done. So yeah, these areas weren't necessarily, the riparian areas, riparian health, and protecting these areas weren't really top of mind in Calgary's history. Certainly if we look at some of the archival pictures of Calgary, you can see that our riparian areas and our river corridors really had much more of a utilitarian function and industrial function. The top picture there of all those logs is actually a picture that was taken of a log float or a log jam along the Bow River near the Eau Claire sawmill, when it was operational as a sawmill. It's now the Eau Claire Market, or at Princess Island Park, that was an operational, functional sawmill for a while. And by the 1950s, many of the portions of the Bow River sort of in downtown were really quite derelict and very much an eyesore. There's a lot of sort of hastily thrown up dikes, a lot of concrete rubble thrown onto these banks, a lot of waste. They really weren't given much care and consideration in the early days of Calgary. Nowadays, we thankfully do have a much greater recognition and awareness of the importance of these areas, and we do have a wonderful network of riparian parks along our rivers and streams. And these areas are now increasingly recognized as that drought and climate resilience piece. So we see here you can think of floodplains as being sort of that bank account. And so where you have a rain event or a storm event, that riparian sponge fills up with water, and then you recharge your water table, and then later in the year, so in the drier part of the year, that water that you've added into your underground bank account can now be released back into your streams and rivers to provide vital base flow later in the season when it's drier. And so Calgary now has a more robust set of policies and plans to try to protect these areas, including a wetland conservation plan, a biodiversity plan, and a riparian strategy, as they've recently done an update as well of their stormwater management strategy, recognizing the importance of riparian areas as well. So one of the things that Cows and Fish has actually been involved with is a long-term monitoring project in Calgary, linked to the city's riparian action program. And we've been involved with doing some long-term riparian health monitoring since 2007 in many of the parks and rivers, rivers and streams across the city. And the city has set targets in terms of where they want to be. They recognize that obviously you're not going to attain healthy riparian areas necessarily because of how, the development intensity in Calgary, but we're looking to see some improvement over time. And you can see that, we are seeing an increase from 2007, we're not quite at that 72% target, but we are seeing, 23% of sites that we've looked at based on our long-term monitoring data set of 56 sites, that we have 23% that are improving and only 9% declining, but there is at least a general trend that most of them are improving or at least staying static. So some of those improvements are linked to, as I mentioned, like the positive influences of the flood. So these are photographs in Inglewood Bird Sanctuary, where you have the flush of poplars coming in after the flood. Some of the improvements are linked to changes in management. So this is Sue Higgins Park in the south of Calgary. This is in 2003. And here you see bank erosion that happened in 2005 along the south reach of the Bow River in what's now called Sue Higgins Park. It used to be called Southland Park. And then the city did some work to stabilize that bank, including putting in rock, but they also put in some plantings above the rock. But importantly, what they did, was they changed this area from being sort of a free-for-all that received a lot of intense pressure from dogs and other recreational use, and they actually fenced it off and did some additional plantings. And what you can see over time is a gradual improvement in the health of this area. So it's becoming more vegetated. You're seeing some natural recovery. And this photograph in 2014 shows you how well it withstood the 2013 flood. And this is a more recent picture at the bottom showing you how this area is recovering over time. And this is the Inglewood area just downstream from 17th Avenue that experienced pretty severe erosion in the 2013 flood, where the city was forced to go in and do some emergency bank repairs to try to protect these houses. But this is now the site of the city's bioengineering demonstration education project. So quite a difference from what it looked like. This is actually a remarkable project where they've done different bioengineering techniques sort of side by side. And it now looks amazingly different. There's been a 15% increase in riparian health since the baseline work that we did in 2016. Very successful and something that they can then learn from. They've done extensive monitoring of this in terms of biodiversity, so fish. It incorporated fish structures, fish habitat structures. They actually changed the topography of the bank bit in here to kind of allow a bit more terrace so that they could create a wildlife passage underneath 17th Avenue Bridge. And so now there's more of a functional wildlife corridor through here. And then they have different techniques. So where they've used plants like willows and poplars and done things like this vegetated crib wall, putting in willow stakes, and actually also retrofitting that rock armor and putting vegetation into that area where they previously just had rock. So this is a pretty impressive project. Definitely worth checking out. That's just below the 17th Avenue Bridge in Inglewood, and there's signage there as well that explains the different techniques. This is another one that really gives me a lot of hope in terms of what can be done and what's in the realm of the possible. For those of you who haven't visited this one, I definitely encourage you to check it out. This is Dale Hodges Park, and this is a large-scale riparian project. This was actually initially, or not too long ago, an active gravel quarry. And this has been transformed into a stormwater constructed wetland. what's used to now treat stormwater from the adjacent communities. And then that water then gets sort of filtered through this wetland into this engineered channel before emptying back into the bow. So it's an area that has completely transformed, and there's boardwalks as well that are incorporated in here, and public art features as well. So it's won many awards, as has the bioengineering project. And as I mentioned, there's been lots of studies that are ongoing to look at the effectiveness of the different projects that are being done in Calgary to see what's working and what's not. And some of those learnings are being then put into practice in Fish Creek Park as well. So using more container plants for some of these restoration works, and then looking at what species of willows are doing best. And following, we've learned a lot in terms of what best practices are working, where we're seeing successful projects. And certainly Fish Creek, has been a lot of effort, and Dylan's been leading that charge to try to have volunteers involved with restoring little pieces of Fish Creek. And that's where you all come in terms of monitoring this creek and trying to prioritize where some of this work is being done. So trying to identify which areas are degraded, which areas would benefit the most from these types of restoration initiatives that are ongoing, and rewilding initiatives that are ongoing in the park. So it's been amazing to see the tremendous amount of work that's been done by community volunteers in Fish Creek for a number of years now. We've been involved, I think, since 2012 in these types of projects. And of course, Fish Creek is also getting a helping hand from the master of ecosystem restoration and river engineering, and that's the beaver. So beavers have come back into the park, and beavers are natural part of riparian ecosystems. They've help to form many of the riparian systems that we have. Their dams slow the flow of the water, they trap sediment, they raise the channel bed, they allow water to kind of infiltrate into the adjacent areas. And in so doing, they create a much more functional riparian habitat. And there's a lot of biodiversity benefits as well. So where you have these wetlands that are created by the beaver dams, that sort of creates a whole new habitat for frogs, for songbirds, for waterfowl, for other animals as well. And so there's a whole suite of benefits that come from having beavers being allowed to kind of re-enter this park and become part of the landscape again. So as you can see here with this diagram, over time, beaver dams sort of build up the sediment behind the dam, and that can change a very sort of deeply incised valley, so one that's cut down into the channel bed, into one that's much more diverse and multi-threaded kind of complex, wonderful, thriving riparian habitat. So beavers, of course, can be a nuisance. They take down trees, they plug culverts, they flood roads. There's a number of issues that can result from beavers. But where we can find, and so the traditional approach with beavers have been to either blow up the dams or en masse eradicate beavers. We're now trying to move away from that and trying to promote more of these coexistence approaches, especially within our headwater landscapes, where we put in, and this has been done in Fish Creek Park, where we've used pond levelers, which is essentially a pipe, a double-hulled pipe that's put in, and you put the pipe in at the level you want the water to be at, and then the one end is submerged and caged off. And it's pretty simple to do, and it's a way to allow the water to not flood pathways or other infrastructure, but to still allow the beaver to exist on the landscape. So this is an example of where it was done in Fish Creek Park, where the pond leveler device was put in. I think that's what this is here. This is actually a culvert protector, I think, that was done here. Anyway, so it allows the pathway to not necessarily be flooded, but the beavers still to exist within this park. So essentially that presentation lays the groundwork for the Riparian Health Assessment. It kind of provides that introduction to why we do this and how we recognize a healthy riparian area. So on Saturday, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be walking you through some exercises in the morning to help tune your eyes to some of the techniques that we use to estimate canopy cover, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then we'll give you some basic plant identification experience as well. So we're going to collect some very common riparian plants and some of the indicator plants that you'll need to know to do the Riparian Health Assessment. So we'll do some plant identification work. And then in the afternoon, we'll have a chance to actually put the tool into action. So as I mentioned, we have developed a number of different assessment sort of tools, everything from a very simple checklist to this workbook that we're going to be going through on Saturday. This is the one that we're going to be using. It's the Riparian Health Assessment for streams and small rivers. There is a different protocol we use for larger rivers, but we're not going to talk about that. And essentially, this one is meant to be applied in any context, in a rural or an urban context. And so, you know, why is it that you'd want to do a riparian health assessment? Why is it useful? Essentially, what it does is it provides a benchmark of current conditions, and as it says here, like obviously a tool to be able to monitor change over time. Within the park, they're using the tool to identify and prioritize areas that they want to restore. It also helps to sort of create an awareness about what are the pieces that are missing and what can we do to bring those missing pieces back. So kind of setting some of those management objectives. And by kind of doing some of the revisit monitoring, we can start to tell good news stories as well, where we see some positive changes happening on the landscape. But most importantly, I think it gets away from this divisiveness about, you know, pointing fingers, trying to lay blame, trying to understand, you know, what's happening, but rather to say, okay, like, how do we all start to look at the landscape from a common perspective? And I hope that, if anything, after this workshop, you'll start to view our landscapes a little bit differently and give you a bit of a richer perspective on these riparian ecosystems when you go for a walk. You'll start to perhaps notice things that you didn't before, or understand how things are connected that you may not have realized before. And as I mentioned, so the tool is essentially meant to give us a quick look at if the riparian area is able to perform some of the key ecological functions that I talked about before. So can it filter the water? Is it providing habitat? Is it providing some of that bank erosion protection? Is it able to recharge the aquifers? Does it still have that sponge-like ability to store and hold water? Is it providing habitat? And essentially the assessment tool for streams is 11 questions. And it can be used by, you know, as a pretty quick tool with some basic training, that like the workshop that we're going to be doing. We do have, as I mentioned, a crew of trained biologists who go out and do detailed inventories. And that, of course, is much more comprehensive. We do look at plant species, we look at the age cover of the whole tree and shrub community, and we collect a bunch of other information as well. So all of our information, or you probably don't need to know this, but if you are interested in learning more, our website, you can access the forums and the user manuals for all of our different methods. And as Dylan mentioned, we do have now a tool, an app, because we had to get, you know, get with the times and come up with an app. So we now have an app that basically condenses all of that workbook information into this app. So if you don't want to bring out the workbook, the app can be used to basically guide you through the questions and provide you with all the information that you need to answer the questions. And it's a free app, but you will have to kind of register. I think you have to put in your email and such beforehand before you can start to use it. So you probably want to just do that ahead of time. In terms of the timing of the assessments, essentially they need to be done when things are green. So during the growing season from June to September, when things start to sort of senesce in the falls, when the leaves start to change color, that's probably not a very good time to do it. And you have to also do it late enough in June that the leaves are fully expressed. And you want to avoid doing it obviously during flooding periods or after high flow periods. And if you're revisiting a site, if you're repeating a visit, you want to do it at roughly the same time. And this you don't really need to worry about so much, because we have sort of standardized where we do these. So Dylan, as he showed you, you each have the 50-meter chunks of bank that you're going to be looking at. And we also have standardized, I think, the extent of the assessment. So we'll talk about that more on Saturday. But typically what you want to do is encompass the riparian area. So that's the flood-prone area where you have your redder and drier riparian species before you start to see a transition to the uplands. Sometimes that can be represented by a topographic break or by a vegetation break. In Calgary, it can be tricky because there's so many introduced plants and such a modification of the plant communities from what would be here naturally. But you guys don't have to worry about that too much. So this isn't a photograph I showed earlier. Actually, I should have updated this. I didn't get a chance. We actually were out there more recently and it looks even better than this. There's been some more willow growth that's actually happened along this site. This is the McLean Creek photo I showed you. This would be an example of a hotspot monitoring site. So you can use the tool to monitor really small localized sites where you've made a management change. And that's essentially what we're doing in Fish Creek Park, is using it as a hotspot monitoring tool, as opposed to looking at representative reaches. This is another approach, is to look at longer reaches. If you did want to look at it on a representative scale, you want to make sure that you're incorporating 2 meander bends into your assessment, so that you can represent inside and outside processes that are happening. So the very first thing you do when you do the assessment, before you answer any of the questions, you have to kind of define what it is and where it is that you're looking. So you want to map out, like we've done here in yellow, you want to map out the area that you're looking at. So this yellow irregular line, this polygon, is, for example, an example of a Riparian Health Assessment site. And all of the questions that we ask relate to that site. So there's a number of tools. We'll talk about this a bit more. I will be bringing a field guide for everybody as well, that has some of the basic plants. And as I mentioned, we're going to be doing some eye tuning techniques because we use this very sophisticated tool, the human eye, to assess many of these parameters. So make sure your eyes are tuned. So this is a quick exercise here. If you guys want to look at this canopy cover diagram, you can kind of, in your own, do this as a, often we do this setup as a poll, but I don't have it set up that way. But kind of in your mind, think about which of these answers is correct. So with these little black dots, would they represent 5%, 10%, 25%, or 50%? We'll give you a couple minutes or like 30 seconds to think about that. So what is the approximate canopy cover of the black dots in the circle diagram? So this just gets you thinking about the idea and the concept of canopy cover. If you answered 10%, you were correct. So we will provide some of these cheat sheets that show you, kind of help to tune your eyes a little bit, and we'll do some calculations as well. For example, like once you know your mapped area in yellow, you can then calculate what is 1% of that look like and what is 10% of that look like. So if 1% is 1 meter by 1 meter, or 10% is 20 meters by 20 meters, that starts to help you answer the questions. So when we do the health assessment, we're looking at 6 vegetation questions and 5 soil and hydrology parameters. So these are, in a nutshell, the different vegetation indicators that we're looking at, and I'm going to work through each of these sort of one by one. The first thing we look at is how much of the riparian area has vegetation cover. So pretty much anything with green plant growth is vegetated. And if you have more than 95% vegetation cover, you would give it a 6 out of 6. And we're looking at, in this question, we're not excluding any of the weeds. We're looking at any vegetation cover, even if it's weeds. So trees, shrubs, what we call grasses or grass-like plants, your sedges and your rushes, and also what we call forbs. So these are your broadleaf flowering plants. So there are different categorizations of weeds, so ones that are noxious and ones that are prohibited noxious. So both of those are what we would consider as invasive, and there are sort of legislative requirements for those to be controlled. And that's because once these invasive species get out of control, they really start to have some harmful detrimental impacts on our native ecosystems. So they start to outcompete native species for food and space. They disrupt food sources for some wildlife. They can have impacts to product production, especially when they're plants that are not palatable or toxic. And then they start to really disrupt the whole biodiversity of the system. So here, this yellow flower, for those of you in Fish Creek, you're probably familiar with it, whether you know it or not. This is leafy spurge, this yellow plant. And you can really see where it's formed a monoculture along this bank that otherwise should have all sorts of different kinds of plants. It's now the main cover. So anytime you have one plant that wants to dominate everything else, it's not a good thing from a biodiversity perspective. So some of the top ones that we see in Calgary would be, as you leafy spurge on the right, Canada thistle, scentless chamomile are examples of noxious weeds. Some of the prohibited noxious weeds that are becoming more of a problem in Calgary. So these are ones that have more stringent eradication requirements. These would be spotted knapweed on the left and nodding thistle, which is a really horrible, hideous, tall, spiky thistle, a nasty one. And then we do have some others that aren't actually regulated, but we do know from all of our monitoring work that they really are invasive in Calgary and in all riparian areas in general. Carigana being one, which is a shrub that's often planted as a hedgerow species, but once it escapes into the riparian areas, it takes over. Same with tufted vetch. It's not actually a regulated weed yet, but it's one that can be quite pervasive once it establishes. And there are a number of tools and identification guides that help explain invasive weeds. I know that Dylan's going to be giving you a book of weeds that are just specific, or invasive plants that are specific to the park. And what we're looking at is not just, you know, how much cover these plants have, but also how they're distributed. So if there's just none of them, it gets 3 out of 3. If there's even one of them or a few of them, it's going to get 2 out of 3. Once you start to see lots of patches and these weeds occurring all over the place, it's going to get 0 out of 3. So this is the example of one that would get 0 out of 3. This is common tansy, very common as well along the Bow River. This is an invasive plant that was originally brought in as an ornamental plant, and now it's escaped and become quite a problem. Then we also look at, so that was invasive weeds. The third one is disturbance plants. So these ones we're not as concerned about because typically over time, as succession progresses, so if you have a disturbance event, whether it's natural, like a flood or a fire, or whether it's human caused, you might get a flush of these types of plants coming in initially to stabilize the ground. But over time, in a healthy system, what would happen is that you'd have other plants come in. You'd have trees, you'd have shrubs, and you start to see your plant community build itself back up. But if over time you have these plants persist and there's something going on that's stopping that natural progression, then we have sort of a problem. So if you have the plant community dominated by these plants like dandelion, like strawberry, like white clover, like barley, and nothing else is seeming to grow there, then there may be a problem. Maybe it's because it's a mowed lawn and nothing else can grow there. Maybe it's because it's heavily grazed. But yeah, so that's when they do become a problem. These tend to be more shallow rooted than fast growing. So for example, Kentucky bluegrass, that's your lawn. As I said before, it's just really shallow rooted and does nothing in terms of protecting the banks from erosion. And so if you have less than 5% of your site covered by those kinds of plants, it would get 3 out of 3. But as soon as you get more than half of your site covered with those types of plants, that's when it would get poor marks. So we get 0 out of 3. And then the next set of questions focuses on that tree and shrub community, because it is such an important part of a healthy site, is having trees and shrubs, which most of our streams and rivers can support trees and shrubs. And so we're looking at indicators like willows, and we're looking to see not only are willows there, but are there young willows present? So if all of us in this room are, 50 or older and there's no young kids around, we'd be a pretty unhealthy community, right? You want to have the young, the teenagers, all ages in there so that you have a self-sustaining population. So if more than 15% of the total woody canopy is of the preferred species is seedlings and saplings, it gets 6 out of 6. But if you have no young ones, then it's 0 out of 6. So some of the ones that we ignore for this regeneration is, there's some that we're not very concerned about, because they do a pretty good job of maintaining themselves, even in heavily grazed situations or heavily impacted situations. These guys will, they're pretty hardy shrubs. So we ignore silverberry or wolf willow, we ignore rose, we ignore shrubby cinquefoil, we ignore buckbrush, and we ignore, of course, any of the invasive ones like carragana, yellow clematis, sea buckthorn, or cotoneaster. So when you're assessing regeneration to say, are there a lot of young plants? If you have a lot of young carragana or a lot of the young invasive shrubs, that's not going to be a healthy site. So we ignore these. We're just looking at, for the preferred shrubs, what I mean by preferred are ones like willows, red osier dogwood, chokecherries, and some of the other ones that we'll show you on Saturday. In Fish Creek Park, we don't have cattle anymore. There used to be historically cattle grazing, but we do have wildlife. And we have a lot of deer in the park. And the trouble with our urban environments is that because we've changed the whole landscape around some of these parks, we often have a concentration of wildlife within these urban parks that can't really go anywhere, or that concentrate their use. And so that can start to impact some of the health of the plant community if some of the preferred shrubs do get overbrowsed. So an example would be on the top picture there, that red osier dogwood with the red bark. You can see it looks like somebody's taken a hedge trimmer to it, and that would be an example of a pretty heavily grazed or browsed situation. We joke and refer to red osier dogwood as the ice cream plant, Everything loves it. It's the first one to disappear if we do have cattle grazing in a site that's not managed well, because there must be something about how it tastes. I don't know. It must be really, really tasty. And so that would be one of the indicators of more heavy use. So if all of your preferred shrubs, if all of your willows and your red osier dogwoods looks like somebody's taken a hedge trimmer to them, that may not be sustainable, right? And some of those plants may die out over time. If, on the other hand, your willows look like that bottom picture, where you have a really smooth bark at the base, and then like this upper canopy, so it has kind of like an umbrella form, that's another example of heavy utilization, where you've had all the lower branches either nipped off and it's been heavily rubbed, right? So, and probably there's no young ones in the understory there. So that's kind of a unusual, unnatural growth form caused by heavy use of the what the animals can access at the base of that shrub. So we're looking at, yeah, these are some pictures of heavily, moderately, and lightly browsed. So if all of them look like that heavily browsed picture, then it's going to score as 0 out of 3. But if it's more in the lighter range, then it gets a higher mark. And then we also look at how much of the woody canopy has been removed, both by people and by beavers. So if there's, you know, a lot of the woody plants, a lot of the trees have been cut down either by beavers or people within your site, then it might get 0 out of 3 if the woody vegetation that is expected to be there has been cut down. Now, although beavers, you know, kind of a short-term impact on riparian health, typically what they'll do is they'll target the willows and the poplars, and those are species that have co-evolved with beavers, and so they'll readily actually resprout and regrow. So although the poplars may be taken out, and you know, you may impact the habitat value, for example, of that riparian area in the short term, very quickly some of these plants that are adapted to beaver herbivory will start to resprout and regrow quite vigorously. So again, this would be an example of a short-term impact that beaver might have, but a lot of those will resprout and regrow. And then we look at, so the dead and decadents. So for the woodies, again, it's like, are there any young ones? Are they being browsed? Are they being cut down? And are they dead or dying, right? So for a lot of your woody plants that are there, if they're all dead and dying, that's not going to do you a lot of good either. So this can result from a number of different factors. It could be from drying out of the watershed if there's upstream diversions of water being withdrawn from a system. It can be a product of just overutilization by wildlife or livestock over a long period of time, causing them to sort of die out from a site. So if you have a tree or a shrub that has more than 30% of the canopy that's dead, that's considered a decadent plant. And if you have more than 50% of your trees and shrubs that are dead or dying, so more than half of them dead or dying, then it's going to get a 0 out of 3. So essentially, we add up all of those different scores for the vegetation, and we'll come up with a score out of 30. And then, and each of these questions we'll work through again. So don't worry, I know I'm throwing out this at you quite quickly, but we are going to work through this again in the field. And then as you work through this exercise yourself, it'll start to make a lot more sense. We're going to go through it again, step by step in the field, and then we'll actually have you, practice doing this on Saturday. So you'll work through each of the questions. It will help you with them. Well, first, we'll give you a sort of a basic understanding of the different plants to look for, and then you're scoring them. So each of the different questions you're scoring out of 6 or out of 3, depending on what it's out of, and then at the end you add them all up. So the next set of questions that are shown here are related to the soil and hydrology of the site. So I'll go through each of these quickly. So first of all, we look at how much of the stream bank has deeply rooted plants. So what is the root mass protection along the stream? So for a stream like Fish Creek, we do expect to see a variety of understory shrubs, as well as the canopy of trees, as well as sedges and rushes as well. So if the portion of Fish Creek looks something, this is not in Fish Creek at all, but if it did look like this, it would score full marks, absolutely. So more than 85% of the bank, and that's looking at the full bank length that you're assessing, has deep binding root mass. And that's again where those plants help to resist erosion and maintain that shading effect that's beneficial for fish and that deep, narrow channel profile. So for root mass protection, it depends, the width that you're looking at depends on the size of the stream. So for larger streams, you're looking at, we'll go through this on Saturday, but for smaller streams, you look at a smaller band for how much of that band, so up to 1 to 2 meters for, a small stream, but up to 5 to 10 meters of bank, you'd expect to have a nice 5 to 10 meter band next to the bank having deeply rooted plants. So it's related to the size of the water body. Since we know that, small streams tend to have less erosive flow. And so this little chart that's in the workbook kind of shows that, for a small river and a larger stream, trees and preferred shrubs are considered excellent for root mass protection. Whereas your introduced grasses and your weeds, it says weeds there, but it should say weeds, would be considered poor. And things like rose, which is an introduced shrub or another shrub, not so much a preferred shrub, it would be considered fair. So yeah, this kind of will help guide you in answering that question. For really small streams, this doesn't really apply for Fish Creek, but if you did have a really small intermittent stream, sometimes you don't see trees and shrubs along some of the really, really small streams, in which case, if you just had native grasses and sedges, that might be good enough for a temporary or an ephemeral type of stream system. For all types of streams, whether it's small or large, if the only thing you have is Kentucky bluegrass, plantain, dandelion, then you're going to get a 0 for that question. Those ones have very little root mass protection. Now, the next parameter, human-caused bare ground, you're simply looking at how much of the site has no vegetation cover, and that because of human uses. So where there's bare exposed soil, whether it's from camping, from cows, from OHVs, from dogs, whatever it is, that's the root cause. That area of human-caused bare soil is what we're concerned with. And so basically, if there's no plants growing there, that soil is subject to erosion, so it can erode and start to impact water quality. So if you have less than 1% of your site with bare soil, it gets 6 out of 6. Anytime you have more than 15% of the site being human-caused bare ground, it's going to get marked poorly. And then we look at that structural alterations. So what alterations are happening within your floodplain, so away from the bank, that start to impact that sponge-like ability to store and hold water. So in this case, we're looking at probably recreational trails in the case of Fish Creek, but it could also be things like bank armoring, where if there's been any erosion protection that's been done. And essentially, yeah, so this is sort of the breakout for how you would score that. And then so you look at the bank separately, and then you look at away from the bank. So you kind of look at both pieces. And where you have a lot of paved pathways, a lot of trampling, a lot of compaction from mowed surfaces, as you can see in the bottom right, that would be considered an altered a floodplain piece. In a grazed situation, you often see this bumpy and lumpy landscape from trampling impacts, but that's not likely to be the case in Fish Creek Park. So again, if you've got more than 25%, so more than a quarter of your site impacted, it's going to score poorly. This last question I'll just touch on, but it's not actually one that you assess because it does require, you can't really assess it for a 50-meter stretch. You have to assess it for a longer stretch. So we actually have done this assessment of incisement along the whole reach of Fish Creek within Fish Creek Provincial Park. But what this refers to, this is actually one of the questions that's scored out of the most number of points. It's scored out of 9, whereas a lot of the other parameters are scored out of 3 or 6. And that's because incisement has so many consequences. So what incisement means is, can the stream access the floodplain in a typical flood event? Can it spill out over the banks quite easily? Or is the bank, as you can see in the bottom picture, is it cut down or incised downward, almost like a trench or a gully, so that if it did flood, it wouldn't actually be able to make it out over the banks? As soon as that happens, your whole riparian area shrinks dramatically. and you lose a whole ton of function just because you don't have, it's no longer a riparian if it's not getting frequent flood event moisture. So anyway, this is just a calculation to show how you would assess that. So if you were to double the depth at bank full, and then you kind of project that outward to see, can the water spill out to twice the bank full depth? But anyway, this is something you don't really have to worry about. It's just interesting. This would be examples of incised channels. Often this happens below culverts, where the channel really cuts down immediately below the culvert, or it can happen in channelized or dredged street stretches as well. We talked about Nose Creek. So at the end of the day, you're going to add up all the different scores for all of the different parameters that you're assessing, and then you're going to come up with an overall score. So in this case, it gets 36 out of 60, which is 60%. So right in the, just into the healthy with problems category. Anything below 60% is unhealthy. 60 to 79 is healthy with problems. Anything above 80 is healthy. And then you can start to see, okay, well, these are some of the issues. We've got a lot of disturbance plants. We've got a lot of browse happening. We've got some bare ground and some alterations on that site. And so when you're in that healthy with problems category, it means that there's been some impairment to the riparian functions, but there are some functions that are still intact. And these are often the ones that we want to focus on for restoration, that healthy with problems, because it's actually, they're easier to bump into the healthy category, and we don't want to see them shift down, right? Whereas where it gets into the bottom category, that unhealthy category, you've lost already quite a lot of pieces at that stage, and it's harder to bring them up into a healthy stage. So this yellow category, this orange category, the healthy with problems, is where we like to focus some of our efforts. So these would just be some examples of what a healthy site might look like. I think intuitively you can look at that and say, yeah, that looks pretty good. There's lots of trees, lots of shrubs, there's very few alterations, very few areas of bare ground. You got some beaver activity. In this case, you've got some more impacts happening. You've got some human-caused bare ground. Looks like you're missing a bunch of willows, but you still have some pieces intact, and you still have that nice meandering channel. Of course, if it looks like this, and these are pretty severe examples, but in this case, you've lost all the pieces. All you're left with is dirt and weeds, and that's not a good situation for ecosystem health. So typically what we would do at the end of these assessments is put together a report for the landowner or the land manager, highlighting the score and highlighting you know, how it compares perhaps to other sites within the project area, and then providing some input as to where there can be improvements made. And then, you know, we do like to go back where we can to monitor a stream after at least 5 years to see how it's doing. These are some examples of sites actually in the McLean Creek area, where we've done some revisits of decommissioned off-hire vehicle use, and you can start to see some natural recovery happening within those areas. So anyway, that was a really sort of quick overview, but hopefully at least at the end of today, you'll have a little bit of a sense of what it is we're going to be doing, what we're going to be looking at, what some of the key factors are that we consider when we are doing riparian health assessments. And certainly on Saturday, we'll have a lot more chance to go through this more thoroughly, to, you know, start looking at the plants. We'll be looking at different plant specimens. We'll be talking about the plants, and then also, you know, practicing using this tool in the groups. And yeah, so hopefully there'll be a lot more chance at that point. And certainly anytime, you know, if over the summer you do have questions, definitely do reach out to us. I'm not going to be around with Cows and Fish for much longer, but I will, you know, my colleagues will be there, and certainly you can follow up with one of them. All right, well, I look forward to meeting everybody on Saturday, and thanks very much for giving up your evening and spending the evening, yeah, with us this evening.
Yes, thank you for coming, and thank you to Cows and Fish for helping us with the training.